Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen stood in a Norman field on the 14th of July. 1944, watching General Omar Bradley raise his binoculars toward a wall of earth and roots that had stopped the entire First Army for 6 weeks. 29 years old, no engineering degree, no official orders. Just a sketch he had scratched onto a ration box 3 weeks earlier. Every Sherman tank that tried to climb over these ancient French hedgerows exposed its thin belly armor to German gunners waiting on the other side. Hundreds of tanks had already burned. Hundreds of crews had already died. But the steel welded onto the front of Cullen's tank that morning had not come from an American factory. It had come from the beaches of Normandy itself, torn from the very obstacles German engineers built to gut Allied landing craft. Bradley lowered his binoculars and said one word: proceed. What happened in the next few seconds would decide whether an entire army could finally break out of Normandy, or whether one sergeant's scrap metal idea was about to fail in front of the general who commanded him. Before we begin, pour yourself a warm cup of coffee or tea. Take a quick look at the clock. What time is it where you are right now? Let us know in the comments. Then sit back and enjoy today's World War II story. Curtis Grubb Cullen had been a soldier for 3 years before he ever picked up a welding torch that mattered. 29 years old, a sergeant with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. He had crossed onto the beaches of Normandy in the first week of June and watched the invasion succeed exactly where the planners expected it to fail. Nobody had planned for what came after. The maps calling this region Normandy bocage looked harmless enough back in England. Green squares of French farmland, neat little property lines drawn in soft pencil on a briefing table. On the ground, those lines were something else entirely. French farmers had been stacking fieldstone and packing earth along their boundaries since the days before gunpowder existed. Centuries of tree roots had woven through those mounds until they stood taller than a man on horseback, thick enough to stop a truck, and old enough that nobody alive remembered them being built. The hedgerows were not hedges. They were walls, and they ran in an unbroken maze across the entire province. Field after field after field, each one sealed off from the next, like a prison built by farmers who had never intended to imprison anyone. American tanks met those walls in the second week of June and kept meeting them for 6 straight weeks. A Sherman driver had exactly 2 options when he reached one of these ancient earthworks. He could try to climb it, which meant tilting the tank's nose skyward and exposing the thin armor on its belly for 3 or 4 agonizing seconds. Seconds that felt, to the men trapped inside, like standing naked in an open doorway. Or he could try to go around, which meant driving into the next field, which had its own hedgerow, which led to another field, and another, an endless grid of dead ends that swallowed advances whole. German gunners understood the geometry perfect. Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank crews simply waited at the far side of each hedgerow, aimed at the exact spot where a climbing tank's belly would appear, and fired. Most Sherman crews never had time to escape the vehicle before it caught fire. Men who survived those weeks spoke afterward of the smell more than anything else. Scorched paint and diesel and something worse underneath it. A smell that stayed in a man's uniform long after the fire was out. By the second week of July, First Army had lost hundreds of tanks trying to cross terrain that on a map measured only a few miles deep. The advance from the invasion beaches had crawled forward less than 10 miles in 5 weeks. Officers back in England were already speaking of a stalemate, and the word carried a particular weight for men who had trained for years believing speed and armor would win this war. Engineers had tried packing explosives into the base of the hedgerows, but the blasts barely dented centuries of compacted soil and only announced the tank's position to German artillery spotters watching from church towers and hillsides. Some crews welded spare track links onto their hulls, hoping the extra metal might stop machine gun fire. It did nothing against a shell fired from 30 feet away. A few desperate drivers tried simply ramming the earthworks at full speed, only to bury their tanks nose first in dirt and roots that had survived since before the United States existed as a country. Engines screaming uselessly against soil that refused to move. Coulin's squadron had been probing these fields since the middle of June, watching tank after tank get gutted the same way, and watching the same young faces disappear from the mess line one at a time. He was not an engineer. He had no formal training in armor design, no laboratory, no budget, no office anywhere near this war. With his name on the door, what he had was a habit of walking the invasion beaches during quiet hours, past the wreckage the Allies had left behind after the landing, turning over the same frustrated question every man in his unit was asking without an answer. Scattered across those beaches were thousands of steel obstacles the Germans themselves had planted months earlier, designed to tear open the hulls of landing craft before they ever reached the sand. Engineers called them hedgerow, 3 lengths of railway, iron crossed and welded through each other so that sharp points jutted out in every direction no matter which way the obstacle landed. Rusting now in long rows above the tide line like the bones of some failed invasion of their own, American demolition teams had spent weeks cutting them apart with torches, and the scrap sat in growing piles near the beachhead, waiting to be melted down or forgotten by anyone who did not have a reason to look twice. Coulin looked at that scrap and saw something nobody else had bothered to see. The steel was thick, hardened, built by German engineers, specifically to rip through hulls under the worst punishment the sea could offer. If a wedge of that steel could tear open a landing craft, it could just as easily tear into the base of a hedgerow, low to the ground, without ever exposing a tank's vulnerable underside to the guns waiting on the other side. He spent 3 days on the idea, cutting sections of hedgehog steel into short prongs and sketching mounts that could bolt directly onto a tank's bowplate, working by lantern light after his official duties ended, welding sparks, lighting up his face in the dark, like a man chasing something he could not quite explain to anyone who asked. He angled the prongs forward and down, so that when the tank met a hedgerow, the steel would dig into the earthen base instead of climbing over it. The tank would simply push straight through at ground level, roots and packed soil, giving way instead of the tank's armor. He tested the design on a light tank first, since a lighter vehicle meant less risk if the mounts failed. 7 times he drove the modified tank at a hedgerow, and 7 times the prongs bit into the earth and the tank came out the other side intact, each successful run met by a silence among the watching crew that felt heavier than any cheer could have been. Word of the tests moved quickly through the squadron, and quickly enough that officers outside his own unit began asking questions. A light tank breaking through was interesting. Nobody yet knew if the same design could survive the impact of a full-size Sherman, a vehicle carrying more than twice the weight and twice the force behind every collision. A tank crew from a nearby battalion volunteered to weld the 4-pronged assembly onto their Sherman and put it through the same test. The first run worked, so did the second, third, and fourth. The mounts held under weight nobody had tested them against before, and the prongs kept doing exactly what Cullen had designed them to do, tearing into the same soil that had swallowed so many stalled tanks. That was enough to reach General Omar Bradley's headquarters. Bradley had spent 6 weeks watching his armor stall in terrain nobody had planned for, and when he heard that a sergeant had solved the problem with scrap steel pulled off the invasion beaches, he asked to see it for himself. The demonstration took place on the 14th of July, 1944, in a field that held one of the thickest hedgerows anyone could find, the same kind of earthen wall that had stopped American armor for over 40 days. Cullen stood beside Bradley that morning with his hands still marked from welding, watching a general study the same wall of dirt that had haunted his own unit for weeks, and wondering whether 3 days of scavenged steel was really about to be judged in front of the man commanding an entire army. Bradley raised his binoculars and watched the modified Sherman position itself 50 yards from the target. The engine roared. The tank accelerated hard across the open ground, and its 4 steel prongs struck the hedgerow with a sound like a freight collision. Dirt exploded upward. For a few seconds, the tank's nose dipped low, straining against root systems that had grown undisturbed for centuries. Then the earth gave way. The hedgerow collapsed inward, and the Sherman burst through to the other side in well under 20 seconds. Bradley lowered his binoculars and walked forward himself, kneeling to examine the torn earth and the severed roots at the base of the gap. He had watched, by his own account, afterward. And something close to disbelief as a wall that had defeated his army for over a month gave way to 4 pieces of scrap steel from a beach obstacle. He turned to his staff and asked how quickly this device could be produced for every tank in his command. Nobody standing in that field yet understood how large that answer would become, or how many lives would depend on the welders who had less than 2 weeks to turn one sergeant's idea into the equipment of an entire army. The order left Bradley's headquarters within hours of the demonstration. Every welding torch in Normandy that could be spared was to be turned toward one task: cutting apart the steel obstacles the Germans had planted on the invasion beaches and turning that scrap into the 4-pronged devices that had just tunneled through a hedgerow in under 20 seconds. Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive First Army had been preparing for since the beachhead was secured, was scheduled to launch on the 25th of July. That gave the ordnance depots 11 days to turn one sergeant's invention into standard equipment for as much of an army as they could manage. 11 days that suddenly felt very small measured against how many tanks still needed fitting. 11 days sounded generous until a man actually stood in front of the beach obstacles and did the arithmetic. The hedgehogs were built from railway iron, thicker and harder than the steel American maintenance crews normally worked with, and cutting torches that sliced through ordinary armor plate in minutes struggled and overheated against it. Forcing crews to stop every few minutes and let the equipment cool before continuing, the prongs had to be shaped, sharpened, and welded into mounting brackets strong enough to survive repeated collisions at highway speed, then bolted onto a tank's bow plate without throwing off the vehicle's balance so badly that its front suspension buckled under the added weight. None of this had ever been done at scale before. It had been done exactly twice, once on a light tank and once on a single Sherman, in the space of a few days, and now it needed to happen hundreds of times over before the sun rose on the 25th of July. Hewlin found himself pulled out of his reconnaissance duties and placed near the production effort as the man who understood the design better than anyone else alive. He was not in charge of the operation, and he had never asked to be. He was simply the person soldiers kept turning to whenever a bracket cracked or a torch burned out or a batch of steel proved too brittle to hold an edge. A sergeant answering questions that officers with far more rank had no way to answer themselves. There was something strange in that a young man from New Jersey who 3 weeks earlier had been an anonymous name on a squadron roster, now walking rows of half-finished tanks in the dark, listening to problems he had never expected to be responsible for solving. The first days of production were slow in a way that felt almost cruel given how little time remained. Crews worked in open fields near the beachhead, sparks lighting up the hours before dawn, torches glowing orange against tents and stacked steel that still smelled faintly of salt, water, and rust. The same obstacles that only weeks earlier had been planted to tear open landing. Craft now being reborn as something meant to protect the men who had survived that landing. Every device that came off the line represented a tank crew somewhere down the line who might climb into a hedgerow fight with a fighting chance instead of a coin flip. Every device that did not come off the line in time represented a crew who would face the same odds that had already burned through hundreds of tanks since June. odds that had already taken friends and bunkmates whose names Cullen could still recite without pausing. Word spread through the maintenance battalions scattered across the beachhead that any welder, "Ane mechanics," any soldier who had ever held a cutting torch was needed at the production sites. Men who had spent the invasion repairing trucks and generators found themselves grinding beach obstacle steel into curved prongs under floodlights run off portable generators, working through the night because daylight had stopped being the only time anyone worked. Some of them had never touched a tank in their lives before that week, yet found themselves kneeling beside a Sherman's bow plate at 3 a.m, guided by men who had learned the process only days earlier themselves. The improvised depot took on the feel of a factory that had been dropped without warning into the middle of a Norman pasture, the ground churned into mud by truck tires, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and flux, and underneath it all, faintly, the smell of the sea that was never more than a few miles away. More than once during those first days, a finished batch of prongs turned out to be flawed only after it had already been welded onto a tank. The steel cracking under a test strike or a bracket, shearing loose the moment weight shifted against it. Each failure meant tearing the assembly off and starting again. Precious hours lost on a clock that never stopped moving toward the 25th of July. Cullen learned to read the steel itself before it was cut, watching for the faint discoloration that meant a section of hedgehog iron had been weakened by rust or by the original blast that tore it from its beach mounting, rejecting pieces that looked sound to men less familiar with the material. It was slow, exacting work disguised as brute labor, and there was no manual anywhere in the United States Army that could have taught it faster than 3 days of scrap welding had taught it. Sleep became something men measured in fragments rather than hours. A soldier might close his eyes for 20 minutes, leaning against a tank hull while his torch cooled, then wake to another shift starting around him. The floodlights never fully going dark, the rhythm of hammers and grinding steel becoming as constant as artillery fire had been during the landings. Some men later remembered the strange, almost feverish energy of those nights. Exhaustion pushed aside by the knowledge that every hour lost meant tanks that would still be climbing over hedgerows instead of punching through them. Bradley made one decision early that shaped everything that followed. He ordered that however many Rhino tanks the ordnance crews managed to produce, none of them were to be used before Cobra launched. Every device, every modified tank was to be held back and concentrated for the opening hours of the offensive rather than trickled out piecemeal to whichever unit asked first. It was a gamble in its own right, holding back a weapon that could save lives. In the meantime, in the hope that using all of it at once would break the entire stalemate rather than simply easing it, was the kind of decision that could look brilliant or reckless depending entirely on what happened on the 25th of July. For the crews already fitted with the device, waiting those final days without using it against the hedgerows, still killing men around them, asked for a kind of patience that did not come easily. By the time that date arrived, the production effort had managed to fit devices onto a large share of First Army's tanks, though nowhere near all of them. Roughly 3 tanks out of every 5 in First Army carried the steel prongs on their bow plates by the morning Cobra began, a fraction that represented an extraordinary achievement for 11 days of work and, at the very same time, an admission that 2 tanks out of every 5 would still be climbing over hedgerows the old way, exposing their bellies exactly as they had for the past 6 weeks. Cullen understood better than almost anyone what that gap meant. It meant that even after everything, some crews would still be facing the war the way it had been in June. And there was nothing left to do about that. In the hours remaining before the offensive began, in the final hours before the offensive, crews who had received a fitted tank only a day or 2 earlier went over the mounting bolts one last time by flashlight, checking welds that had barely had time to cool some of them still carrying the faint burn marks on their gloves from finishing the work themselves. For men who had spent 6 weeks watching hedgerows swallow tanks whole, there was a strange, uneasy hope in staring at 4 crude steel prongs bolted to their own bowplate, not yet knowing whether the thing would behave the way it had in testing or fail the first time it mattered. Operation Cobra began before sunrise on the 25th of July, 1944, with one of the largest aerial bombardments American forces had used in the European theater up to that point. Waves of Allied bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives onto German positions near St. Lo. A bombardment intended to shatter the German defensive line before a single tank crossed the start line. The ground shook for the better part of an hour and a half, a sound men described afterward as something felt in the chest more than heard. Dust and smoke rising high enough to blur the horizon even from miles behind the front. The bombing did not go perfectly. Some bombs fell short of their targets and struck American soldiers waiting in their own assembly areas, killing dozens of men. Among them, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the most senior American officers to die from friendly fire during the entire war. It was a brutal reminder, before the offensive had even truly begun, that nothing about this war moved forward without paying for it in blood, including the plans meant to save lives, men who had spent 11 days welding steel onto tanks so that fewer soldiers would die. Crossing hedgerows now learned that soldiers had died before the tanks even reached the start line. A grim arithmetic that nobody in that field could make sense of in the moment. When the bombing stopped, the silence that followed felt unnatural to the men waiting to advance, the kind of quiet that made soldiers strain their ears for the return of noise they had spent 90 minutes hating. Then the armor moved. 2nd Armored Division led the assault into the bocage, tanks fitted with Cullen's steel prongs rolling toward the same hedgerows that had swallowed Advance's whole since the 2nd week of June. Engines and treads filling the silence the bombers had left behind. The difference showed almost immediately. A Sherman fitted with the device would accelerate hard toward a hedgerow, strike the earthen base with its 4 steel prongs, and punch straight through in a matter of seconds rather than climbing skyward and exposing its belly, the way every tank before it had been forced to do. Reports reaching headquarters that morning described tanks crossing hedgerow after hedgerow in the time it used to take to cross one. Fields that had taken entire days to secure now falling in minutes. Radio traffic filling with the same kind of disbelief that had crossed Bradley's face 11 days earlier, watching the first demonstration. The tactical reason ran deeper than raw speed. German defensive doctrine in the bocage had been built entirely around the assumption that American tanks had no way to cross a hedgerow except by climbing over it. Panzerfaust teams positioned themselves for upward shots at the exact moment a tank's underside became exposed at the top of a hedgerow. Anti-tank guns were aimed at the predictable spot where a climbing tank would appear, sights already set before the fighting even began. When Rhino tanks punched straight through at ground level instead, never exposing that vulnerable belly, those carefully prepared firing solutions became almost worthless in an instant. German gunners were left aiming at a spot no tank needed to pass through anymore. Their carefully rehearsed defense suddenly fighting a war that no longer matched the ground in front of them. Inside those tanks, the experience of a hedgerow crossing had changed completely in the space of a single morning. Where a crew once braced for the sickening tilt of the tank's nose rising skyward, exposing them to whatever waited on the other side, they now felt only the jarring impact of steel meeting earth. A shudder through the whole hull, and then open ground ahead before the German gunners on the far side had time to adjust their aim. Drivers who had spent 6 weeks flinching at every hedgerow found themselves accelerating into them instead. A change in instinct that took most crews the better part of a single day to trust completely. Not every crossing went cleanly. The devices were new, hastily produced under enormous time pressure, And not every hedgerow behaved the way the ones used in testing had behaved. Some hedgerows concealed buried stones or old fence posts that could catch a prong and bend it. And a small number of tanks lost the use of their device partway through the advance, forced to fall back on the older and slower methods of crossing. Losing a device in the middle of a fight was frightening for the crew involved. The sudden jolt of steel catching on something unseen underground. The engine straining against resistance that refused to give the way it had every other time. It did not slow the offensive as a whole because so many other tanks around them kept moving, but for the men inside a tank that had just lost its edge, the war outside their hatch had not changed at all. By mid-morning, 2nd Armored Division had advanced further than it normally covered in several days of fighting. 3rd Armored Division, following behind, reported similar progress. The bocage that had defended the German line for 6 weeks was collapsing, not because the terrain had changed, but because the terrain no longer offered German defenders the advantage they had been relying on since June. Fields that had once taken an entire day of careful, costly fighting to secure were being crossed and left behind before the sun had fully cleared the tree lines. German units began falling back faster than their own commanders could organize new defensive lines. Prisoners captured in the days that followed described watching American tanks tear through hedgerows they had considered impossible to breach. And some spoke of anti-tank crews abandoning their positions the moment they realized the tanks bearing down on them were not going to climb into the open the way every previous tank had. The psychological effect on German defenders was, by several accounts, nearly as important as the physical one. A defense built entirely around one assumption had just watched that assumption stop being true in the space of a single morning. And men trained for weeks to fight. One kind of battle suddenly found themselves fighting a different one they had no answer for. By the last days of July, the advance had carried 1st Army well beyond the fields where the offensive began. Opening ground that would soon allow entire armored divisions to maneuver freely for the first time since the invasion. German forces further east, still trying to hold a line against an advance that would not stop cutting through terrain they had counted on to slow it, found their options narrowing, with every hedgerow that fell in seconds instead of hours. None of the men welding prongs onto tanks in that Norman pasture 2 weeks earlier could have known they were helping, set the stage for an encirclement that would trap thousands of German soldiers in the weeks ahead. But the momentum that made it possible began in those 11 days of round-the-clock welding. Word of Cobra's early success and the role the hedgerow cutters had played in it spread quickly beyond 1st Army. Within weeks, the British Army had developed its own version of the device, producing hundreds of their own steel prongs and fitting them to their tanks under a different name. An idea that had started as 3 days of scrap welding by a single sergeant on a beach in Normandy was, within a matter of weeks, being manufactured by more than one Allied army, each one adapting the same basic principle to their own equipment. Back near the production depots, the work did not stop once Cobra launched. Crews continued fitting devices onto tanks, moving up to reinforce the advance, and maintenance teams learned to repair bent or broken prongs in the field, rather than sending damaged tanks all the way back to a depot. A device that failed against a hidden obstacle could often be straightened and re-welded well within a day, keeping tanks in the fight instead of pulling them out of it for good. Repair crews grew almost as practiced at fixing the prongs as the original welders had been at building, learning the weak points in the mounting brackets through hard experience, rather than any manual written before the offensive began. Casualty reports compiled by 1st Army in the days following Cobra's launch showed a marked change from the 6 weeks that preceded it. Tank losses per engagement and the number of crewmen killed or wounded inside those tanks both fell noticeably compared to June and early July. Some officers and later historians would credit the hedgerow cutters with saving well over 1,000 American lives in the days surrounding the breakout. though the exact number would always be difficult to separate from the countless other factors at work in those chaotic weeks. The bombing, the weather, the sheer momentum of an advance that had finally started moving again. For the men who had spent 11 sleepless nights welding beach scrap onto tank hulls, the number mattered less than the radio reports themselves. Crews reporting hedgerow after hedgerow crossed without losing a man, something none of them had dared to expect only 2 weeks earlier. There was a plain arithmetic underneath all of it that few men had time to sit with while the offensive was still moving. Each Sherman tank represented months of training for its crew and a considerable cost to produce and ship across an ocean. And each one lost to a hedgerow ambush had meant not just a burned-out hull, but 3 or 4 or 5 men who would never fight again. Measured against that, 4 pieces of scrap steel cut from a beach obstacle and welded together by exhausted men working through the night had cost almost nothing at all. And the trade being made in those final days of July, precious little against precious much, was not lost on the crews who lived through it. By the end of July, American forces had pushed well beyond the hedgerow country that had trapped them since June, opening the way toward Avranches in the open countryside of France. Beyond it, the stalemate that had defined the campaign since the beachhead was secured had broken, not because a new weapon had been invented in a factory somewhere in England or the United States, but because a sergeant walking a beach littered with enemy scrap had looked at the wreckage of a German invasion defense and seen a way to save his own army's tanks. Instead, Cullen remained with the effort as the advance continued, watching tank after tank roll past fitted with the steel prongs he had first shaped by lantern light less than a month earlier. He had not slept properly in days by the time the breakout was underway, his hands marked with burns from hot metal, and he understood, standing in that field, watching columns of Rhino tanks move toward the front, that something about this war had shifted because of what he had built. He thought more than once in those days of the men who had burned in their tanks during June and the first weeks of July, men whose names he still remembered clearly, and wondered quietly whether a few more days of welding, started a few weeks earlier, might have changed what happened to them. It was not a question anyone could answer for, and he carried it forward with him the same way he carried the burns on his hand. Whether history would remember his name the way it remembered the generals who gave the orders, the men whose faces appeared in newsreels and newspapers, was a question that had not yet been answered, and one that would not be answered for years to come. In the weeks after Operation Cobra broke the stalemate that had trapped First Army since June, Cullen's name moved steadily upward through the chain of command that had once known him only as a sergeant in a reconnaissance squadron. Bradley recommended him for the Legion of Merit, the nation's 4th highest military decoration, an award almost never given to a man of Cullen's rank. The citation credited him with exceptional ingenuity in solving a tactical problem that had cost the Army dearly for 6 weeks, and with contributing directly to a breakthrough that opened all of France to the advancing Allied armies. For a sergeant who had built his device from scrap steel and 3 sleepless nights, it was recognition that few men in his position could have expected to receive. But the war did not pause to let him enjoy it. Cullen returned to his unit and to the fighting that continued east across France through the late summer and into the autumn. The same war that had never stopped simply because one problem inside it had been solved. By November, his division had reached the dense, freezing woodland along the German border known as the Huertgen Forest, a battle that would come to be remembered as one of the costliest and most miserable the American Army fought in Europe, a place of endless mud and shattered trees where progress was measured in yards rather than miles. It was there, 4 months after he had stood beside Bradley watching a hedgerow collapse in the summer sun, that Curtis Cullen stepped on a landmine. The explosion cost him his leg. The man who had spent 11 sleepless days making sure other soldiers' tanks could cross a battlefield safely found himself carried out of that same battlefield on a stretcher. His own war ended not by the enemy he had outsmarted with beach scrap and a welding torch, but by a single buried mine in a forest that offered no clever workaround, no scavenged steel, no invention that could have saved him from it. He spent months recovering, first in field hospitals, close enough to the front that he could still hear artillery in the distance, and then in facilities further removed from the war entirely, learning to live with an injury that would follow him for the rest of his life. The same hands that had shaped steel prongs by lantern light now had to learn the slower, more frustrating work of relearning how to walk, how to stand, how to move through a world that had not paused to wait for him while he did it. The Legion of Merit citation eventually caught up with him during that recovery, a formal acknowledgement of what he had done in July, arriving while he was still adjusting to what November had taken from him. There was a bitter irony in it that few war stories managed to capture so plainly. A man honored for saving countless lives while paying, in the same war, with a piece of his own body. Cullen was discharged and returned to the United States as the war in Europe wound toward its final winter and spring. He came home to Cranford, New Jersey, the town he had left 3 years earlier, no longer the same young sergeant who had walked out with nothing but a service record ahead of him. In September of 1945, not long after Japan's surrender ended the war entirely, he married Bernice Enright. They settled in New York City, and Cullen found work as a salesman for Schenley Industries, a liquor distribution company, a job with no connection whatsoever to tanks, hedgerows, or the battlefield that had taken his leg and, in its own strange way, made his name. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder carried into every ordinary day that followed, into sales calls and office meetings and quiet evenings in a Manhattan apartment that had nothing to do with the war at all. Nobody meeting him across a desk at Schenley Industries in those years would have guessed that the man selling them liquor contracts had once stood beside a 4-star general watching a hedgerow explode, or that the same leg he no longer had been lost, solving a very different kind of problem in a forest a few hundred miles from where he first sketched his invention. Civilian life did not care much about wartime invention. The years immediately following the war were full of larger headlines, the shape of a new peace, the beginning of a new kind of global tension, and a tank modification devised in a Norman field in July of 1944 became, for most Americans, a footnote if it was remembered at all. Cullen worked steadily at Schenley through the years that followed, rising by the late 1950s to a position as a junior executive within the company. He lived quietly. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoirs of his own. And he did not seek out the kind of public recognition that his invention, by any reasonable measure, might have justified. It was General Bradley, not Cullen, who kept the story alive in the years after the war. In 1951, Bradley published his own account of the campaign, a memoir describing the Normandy breakout in detail, including the demonstration in that Norman field and the sergeant whose scrap steel device had solved a problem that had baffled an army for more than a month. Military historians studying the European campaign began citing the invention in their own accounts of Operation Cobra, and the Army's official histories of the war in Europe included their own descriptions of the device and its impact on the breakout. But outside of military history circles, in the ordinary run of American life, Curtis Cullen remained an unfamiliar name, a man selling liquor in Manhattan who happened to have changed the direction of a war. He died on the 20th of November, 1963. In Greenwich Village, Manhattan, he was 48 years old. He was buried in Westfield, New Jersey, not far from the town where he had grown up and later returned to as a young veteran, learning to walk on an artificial leg. His obituary in the local papers mentioned his Legion of Merit and, briefly, his role in developing the device that had helped break the Normandy stalemate, but the notice was modest. A few lines in a hometown paper for a man most of the country had never heard of. What happened next, Cullen never lived to see. 7 months after his death, on the 6th of June, 1964, President Dwight Eisenhower gave a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite, marking the 20th anniversary of the Normandy invasion. The interview was filmed in the same hedgerow country where the war had once stalled for 6 weeks. The same earthen walls still standing decades later, still thick, still green, still exactly the obstacle. They had always been. Eisenhower, who as Supreme Allied Commander had once approved the very campaign Cullen's invention helped unlock, told Cronkite the story of the sergeant and his hedgerow device on national television, describing how one soldier's improvised solution had helped break open the bocage when nothing else had worked. Millions of Americans watched that broadcast. For many of them, it was the first time they had ever heard the name Curtis Cullen, delivered not by a military historian or an official Army publication, but by a former Supreme Allied Commander speaking from the very ground where the invention had proven itself 2 decades earlier. Cullen was not alive to hear it. He had died not knowing that his contribution would ever reach an audience beyond the pages of a general's memoir and a handful of official Army histories. In the decades since, the story has settled into a quieter kind of permanence than a single television broadcast could offer. The Army's own history of its ordnance innovations includes an account of the device that still bears his name. A Sherman tank fitted with an original hedgerow cutting device is preserved and displayed by the National Museum of the United States Army, where visitors can see, up close, the crude steel prongs that once tore through a wall of earth that had stopped an entire army. In Cranford, New Jersey, a public memorial outside the municipal building honors Cullen and the invention that carried his name into the town's own history, a small, permanent acknowledgement in the community where he grew up and where he is still remembered as more than a name in an Army file. The device itself did not remain in wide use, much beyond the campaign that made it famous. As American forces pushed beyond Normandy into terrain that no longer required specialized hedgerow breaching equipment, most units removed the steel prongs from their tanks. And by the war's end, the Rhino device had become, like so much wartime equipment, a piece of history rather than an active tool, but the underlying lesson that a soldier without rank, without an engineering degree, and without approval from anyone above him could look at a battlefield problem and solve it with whatever material happened to be lying nearby. Outlasted the steel itself. It shaped the way the Army thought about field innovation for decades afterward, and it remains in military history, classrooms and museum placards alike, one of the clearest examples of an ordinary soldier changing the course of a campaign. Curtis "Grub" Cullen never sought that legacy. He built his device because tanks were burning and men were dying, and he thought he saw a way to stop it. He paid for that war in his own body 4 months later, in a forest far from the beaches where his idea began. And he spent the rest of his life working a regular job, raising no monuments to himself, asking for no attention beyond the medal a general had already decided he deserved. It took a president, speaking on television 7 months after Cullen's death, to finally tell the country what he had done. By then, the sergeant who welded beach scrap onto Sherman tanks so that other men could come home was already gone. But the men who did come home, and the families waiting for them, carried the proof of what he had built long after his name had faded from the headline.